let's go ahead and we'll move to the second question. And the second question says, how did popular media, books, magazines, comics, radio, television, movies, and music influence the work of the Carvers? Ron, can you start with that one?
I don't know. The question is asking me something about, I mean, I can speak to my family's work on this. I would say maybe some cartoons, more so, again, I spoke about this in the article, National Geographic was a great source of reference for a lot of the pieces that were being made in the studio at that time. They used Mutual of Omaha, I spoke of this also, was another show that was viewed often for reference to do the more exotic animals, for sure. Other than that, I would not say, I mean, even in my, I think that you are influenced by all sorts of things. People that come into your life, places you've been, experiences with your family, whatever it may be. So it was a mismatch of everything. I don't think you can pin it down to one of these things in particular. I think they all, it was all part of it. All of the things you have listed here.
Luis? You know, for me, the animal, I'm not necessarily an animal carver, but to me, the animal is an experience of our life since man has been around. I mean, it's very true in the oldest petroglyphs around, animals are represented. They influence us, they express our feelings, they express our doubts, they express our fears. We use the animal imagery to express our own feelings. An example of that is, for me, was a year ago, I was looking for a Valentine's card for my wife. And went into the Hallmark store and started looking at all the cards that were available there. And there's Grandma and Grandpa looking at the sunset, and love expressed underneath. And then there's two little kids dressed up as grandparents looking at the sunset, and that's another love. And then there's two puppies kissing. I mean, what better expression of love is there than these two animals, right? I mean, so that's the card I got. And needless to say, I should have bought jewelry.
The image of two puppies kissing, I'm terrified, horrified.
But the animal has been part of our lives. I don't think there's an artist around that has not tried to create an animal in their work somehow. It's been part of my life. I've done many pieces with animals, incorporated in them, and it goes since day one. So Felipe's favorite, being that his favorite line, his favorite means of expression is very interesting, because he had a lot of those feelings.
Absolutely. Well, again, like we said earlier, with the vulgarity and the humor and it's all, there were lots of family pets too. There was animals in the yard, chickens, goats, whatever, dogs, lots and lots of dogs, cats. And there was a regiment of the dogs needed to know certain tricks, and everybody had a regiment. Very controlling. You were expected to do certain things a certain way all the time. And the regiment would change without your knowledge often. So I don't know. The animal thing is true. You're absolutely right about that. Christine?
Well, just to kind of descend into anecdote as well. I mean, Felipe had a very special relationship with animals.
Absolutely.
He would get very upset if people mistreated animals, and he would yell at them. Why don't you feed your dog? That kind of thing. Or why don't you take care of your dog? And he took in dogs especially. And I guess, for me, the fact is that he could take an animal and turn it into the entire symbol of that creature. The pig is probably one of the best examples that, his pigs are not, there's no cartoon there. Not even close. They are the kind of pigs that would eat you if you fell into the pen. And so he really had the ability to express the the essence of that animal, the base nature of a creature, of all of us, that we all have a base nature. And also, I find in a lot of his work not just humor, but anger. I see a lot of ferociousness and, trying to corral perhaps his own anger at the world. He came from, I think, a fairly abused background. As a youngster, he was very young when he had to depend on himself, and he was always kind of barely under control. You had that sense.
It didn't take much to go beyond loss of control.
Right,
He was on that edge.
and you sense that in many of the creatures that he makes, and they hardly ever, if ever, descend into the cartoon world. If they do go that way, the suspicion is that it really isn't a piece that Felipe made himself.
That's accurate.
Well, I'd again set up some polls here to come at this question also. First of all, politically, again, Felipe is discovered in a moment that populism is reasserting itself in the American experience. We've come out of the 50s, and suddenly we have people that want to go back to the earth and want to go back to simpler life. We have hippies and compounds, and all of the lifestyle that came in the 60s was predicated on the notion that down in the real world, at the level of the real earth, real people can get along and can have quality of life without all kinds of gadgets and all kinds of expensive consumer goods. At the same time, the technological revolution is setting in, and we're having a world that's racing in a completely different direction. And so these two things are tugging at each other, and folk art got a big bump in the 70s for two reasons. One, it was in the direct aftermath of the 60s when all of that, sort of grow it and eat it world had gained a great popularity and a foothold into popular culture. It was also at the same time that politically we were looking for more voices to find an expression in the American experience. And Cesar Chavez and all kinds of people are bringing other points of view and other demands for respect for other elements within the society to the forefront. So Felipe, in one sense, gets a bump up in this moment, you see, because he's somebody who does live close to the earth, as has been said. His portraiture, has a penetrating quality to it, which in some ways, and I'm not exaggerating, is not unlike that which we assign to Rembrandt when we look at his self-portraits and realize how penetrating those images are, that looking into the mirror, he showed us the inner artist. Felipe could do this with the animals. Everyone up here agrees. On the other hand, it's also the time when animals have become abstracted and have become popularized. It started earlier, of course, with a mouse with big ears that sang and danced, but by the 70s we got Scooby-Doo. He's a talking dog, and he runs around with Shaggy and all of those other kids and solves crimes. Now, this means that in popular culture, which is the subject of the question here, we've got something working very much against anybody having any of the insights or any of the, or being able to make any of the kind of accurate observations that artist could make when he looked at a bear or looked at a pig. The pigs are brilliant. He gets it, right? And he shares it. And then I would suggest also then, there's another idea I have here, and it's not mine alone, but I believe it profoundly, that art making is a cultural process. It's probably not an individual activity. Artists in that sense make stuff for us, but they don't make it outside of us because they are us. They just happen to have abilities that they put in the service of something that we need done. Which is to say that Michelangelo up on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is painting some pictures for the Pope, but those pictures don't live in history unless they connect with an awful lot of people, and 5 centuries later people are still going over there to look at them because they get something from it. This is the shared experience of art. And so if Felipe's product is culturally mandated and culturally encouraged and supported and discovered and patronized at that moment, That's a good thing, and we can explain it that way, but we also have to understand the blockages that move in at the same time to occlude it or cut it out of the mainstream. And some of these things are also products of the popular culture that was gobbling up everything and still continues to gobble up everything around us. Popular culture is the driver of our world right now. Whether we like it or not, this old business of high art and low art has all been mediated through this center, if you will, that is popular culture. And so Felipe is swept along with a popular culture that wants to go back to the earth and know other life forms more profoundly and more poetically, and at the same time is having all of that information jammed and jazzed by Scooby-Doo. And I think if you just stay with me on this one, you can understand Felipe, you know, in a crunch here, right? And the art continues to live in that crunch, and then as the world has moved ahead with other concerns, I have to say, in some ways he's been sort of overlooked and left behind. And it's important that this exhibition comes now and that this panel and you as an audience share in this conversation that needs to take the next step as to why Felipe and why not Felipe and in what way Felipe, and a greater and a reinforced discovery of the real power and specialness of his art.
I remember him telling me one time that he didn't watch a lot of television. I don't remember how he did it in his words, but he said he thought, he didn't say stupid, but I remember him saying that they were simply other people's ideas, and he wasn't interested in that, which is a lovely, except for the dating game and maybe Mutual of Omaha and watching television that had animals. And I just have to say that a lot of what was going on in the yard was market driven. I mean, at one point, Ron, you tell me if I'm exaggerating, there were like 180 orders.
As you were saying, Jimbo Davila, I think, once said it was the art orgy of the 80s. You know, there were everyone was doing well with it.
What did Jimbo say?
Something like the art orgy of the 80s or something. I thought I saw Jimbo here.
By the way, if he wants to, perhaps we ought to take Jimbo the microphone. But
Where is Jim? There's Jim.
he's sitting in there.
Anyway, so he could speak on this too, that everyone was doing really well. My own experience, you were allowed to watch, not really speak much, just kind of learn. And I think that's why Felipe and I kind of got along. But to touch on what Davis was saying, it was quite popular. And I think, I don't want to say luck, because I think that maybe for the rest of us there was a bit of luck being part of Felipe's world. And having him, he didn't include everyone either. He was very judgmental in to some regard as to, you know, what your intent was and how far you were willing to go with all this. He was also quite moody, so, you know, the reward was there though. If you hung in it, you know, it was well worth it. And but what you were saying, Davis, that at that time people would come through much like a store, much like a grocery store or a restaurant. The amount of vehicles pulling up daily, it was a daily occurrence, daily. It started to disrupt his life. I think at some point he even started to resent it because he had almost no privacy. He resented being photographed at a point. You know, and also age was playing a factor. He was getting older and a bit more bitter and harder, crusty. This is just my observation. I don't know if it's accurate. I don't know what was actually going on in his head. He wasn't the man that would really share his innermost secrets with you and give you a hug. You know, but it was quite busy in the right after what Michael was talking about, and Davis and Christine came upon the best part of the time in that yard. Before a lot of people came to help work, and it was just Felipe, you know. So I think you guys saw and witnessed some of the glory days before it was absolutely too popular, and he needed help to fill those orders. He felt an enormous Not to the money or not. We were doing it because we needed to pay our bills or whatever. He felt responsible to the person that came to him for something. He felt almost indebted to this person, be it even if it was a small piece. If somebody ordered 3 or 4 things, he would do his best to get you one. And you know, in that. And again, always the message was do your best. Do you know, honestly. So, Luis, Bill?
If I could just add another complexity here. You hit it on the head. The mid to late 70s was a time when it was clear what was going on in the yard. But I would bring you to another artist in exactly that same time frame about whom at that time we could also be equally clear. This is an artist, though, from another side of the larger picture we're looking at here, and that would be Luis Jimenez. You familiar with his work? Another great New Mexican artist, all right? Now set the two of them up, and don't see them as oppositional, but see them as a part of a larger whole of the sort that I just described, where we have a culture busily trying to figure itself out and to describe itself and celebrate itself through the work of those in its midst designated to be its artists and to do this job for them. And then we have Felipe in a different kind of a context, and even Luis would have been clearer in 78 and 82 than he is today. And so some of the confusion and what seems to be the obscuring of Felipe's power and his importance is really just the fact that time has moved on and the pot's been stirred again and the values have been churned over and displaced. And so we need to go back and find these artists historically, and then we also need to ask ourselves, do we really want to keep them with us? And if we're going to keep them with us, in what new ways can they be applied to the world of 2015?
Luis, can you speak to that, since you were great friends with Luis Jimenez and some of his ideas, ideals?
Friend that I miss almost on a daily basis in the studio. Luis was, his interest, it's kind of interesting. I'm trying to bond the two of them together somehow, but I can't do it mentally. For the reason, for the reason that Luis's work was, wow. He was dealing with more social issues. He was dealing with his Hispanic life more. He was dealing with the problems of the borders. He was dealing with poverty and so on. Not saying that Felipe wasn't, but I don't think that it reflected in Felipe's work so much as it did in Luis's work. Luis's wanted to introduce Hispanic people, well, he wanted people to be introduced to Hispanic people and Hispanic culture and Hispanic life. Yeah, it was a little bit different generation. But Luis's impact is immense, and it's unfortunate that he passed at such a young age, because I think he had a lot more to offer, but unfortunately that's not what it is.
Mike, you might be interested in knowing that we put together a show of material that went to the Museum of South Texas in Corpus Christi, and at the time that exhibit opened, there was also an opening of a Luis Jimenez show of the dance hall, the honky tonk dance hall, and Luis Morales was there as well at that same time. I mean, you can kind of get nostalgic about some of these periods in time when things seemed to be a little bit purer, because I guess the galloping nature of popular culture and everybody trying to get some sort of a piece of the action, which certainly Felipe suffered from. And I think in the folk art world, one way that has been dealt with is by the creation of a separate category called outsider art, which I'm not sure I even really know what it is any more than I know what folk art is. Trying to identify people like Felipe as somehow being out there. And when it was first applied, it was often applied to people who were in fact mentally ill. And I kind of would like to hear Michael talk about outsider art and where that fits into it, because, you know, my own feeling is that Felipe is not an outsider. He's an artist. I mean, to brand him as somehow being, to me, it always implies a little bit out of it, you know, and you're outside the culture, or you're outside the mainstream. I think that's where that phrase maybe strikes me as somewhat demeaning.
Well, we could spend the rest of the afternoon on the subject of the outsider. Simply put, I'm not a big devotee of this idea, nor am I an exponent of that as a useful term in talking about art, because in a simple scheme here, to take the outsider idea to the extreme, your premise is that society or culture is a bad thing. And so if culture or society touches an artist, it has somehow dirtied or sullied or corrupted that artist. And so the only real pure and wonderful art would be art that's not touched by the world. This would make the only interesting artists be aliens from outer space. And that would make Roswell the center of the art world, and it isn't happening that way. So I'm done with this outsider thing. It was never very interesting to me, because clearly I've already identified that my position is that art is a cultural collaborative kind of an activity, so the idea of the outsider doesn't work here. So I would suggest that Felipe did speak from and to an entire community, and that's the folk art nature of what he does. And I would also suggest that Jimenez also spoke to a specific community. One community was more traditional and rural, the other community was more vanguard and urban. But between these two artists, and that's why I set up the comparison here, there's a spectrum of possibility that very much was of that time, and I would argue that they can be compared, because they did both speak from their experiences and from their specific communities back to those communities in ways that ask others to step in and participate, and maybe participate even vicariously, to know those values and to know those people, the people that those artists represented. So I set that up just, you know, for an extreme comparison, but I think it's useful as we talk about that time, because there were forces in play that were bringing Felipe to the front, and of course it was like a runaway train, as you say. It became orders he never could fill, and collaboratives, you know, that could have gone on forever, and the ultimate, what do they call it, the reductio ad absurdum, which is the barking coyote school of Santa Fe commercial folk art. Don't you love it? But what, that's that, and you still have to talk about that too, because in some way it's connected, and the question was about popular culture. And Luis was the same when you start talking about lowrider culture, and you start talking about those cars, you start talking about the honky-tonks. And so I think this is all part of a larger whole. The problem for us today, that many years later, is to revitalize it, if it can be revitalized, but that's a collective enterprise, and to assign it perhaps new and extended meanings. And this is possible also. When I taught art history, I used to introduce Michelangelo's Last Judgment. And I'd say, everybody in the room that's a Catholic, raise your hands. And then half the room would raise their hands. I'd say, okay, you need to know from the start here that half of the room that just raised their hands see these slides differently than the rest of you do. Now let's see if we can find some common ground, and let's share in this, and then let's have a complete experience that may be an art experience for the whole room. And I would take it from there. This is a similar kind of thing that I'm asking for tonight. How do we take Felipe Archuleta and reprocess him and reapply him to our present situation, so that he can remain durable, you know, as an active artist and an active force in American art? Folk art isn't even the issue here. It's all of American art that I would be interested in. All of us. Okay. Absolutely. Everyone in this room and beyond. So talk to him.
Sign me up.
Well, Michael's introduction of politics and American exceptionalism and those things. I had to think back, and I think I'm right in remembering that he never uttered a political thought in the time I knew him. He certainly wasn't a partisan in any way that we would understand. I don't think he ever gave politicians a thought. I mean, he might have pushed the Democratic lever like a lot of people in New Mexico, northern New Mexico did, but so it's curious. The other thing is and I don't know if this is appropriate to this panel, but is maybe Felipe's sexual rage, because he was furious that he was getting old. I mean, he talked about being like an old dog, and life was not as much fun anymore. So a lot of I can't extrapolate except to say that that might have been a part of what he was doing, like Picasso. I mean, Picasso certainly had a lot of sexual rage, and so there we have it. I'll turn this over to some art historians down there.
Do you want to go with rage at all?
Not necessary. There's enough here.
Okay, okay. Let's move on to the last question. What role did the local and national art economies play for the animal folk carvers here in New Mexico? And Luis, do you want to start with that one?
Okay. Well, I'm not a folk carver. I mean, I'm not an animal carver, so
Right.
I can't tell you how that works. But I can tell you in general, as far as folk artists, it's taken an impact here lately. Folk artists are, from not only from my standpoint, from the standpoint of other artists, the Spanish market, the local artists. I understand there's a big impact on the economy on them right now. And you try to question the reasoning why that might happen, and there's all sorts of answers to that in a way. And one is redundancy in art, in folk art, can be a problem. When the creative line ends, when the financial line becomes first priority, that sometimes changes. And what I mean by that, how many St. Francis's can you make? And how many collectors are there out there to collect St. Francis? So I think that impact is hard on the folk artists of New Mexico right now. And of course the collector isn't there. The collectors change. There's a younger collector out there, and I don't know if their interest is what their parents wanted or have. Because I've noticed, especially with my work, that a lot of the pieces are being donated to museums, which is fantastic. But that tells me that the younger generation is not interested in my work so much. And so I think that financially that's going to be a big impact on folk art in New Mexico here in the near future.
I in a way was in a very fortunate position growing up under all these great artists, Luis included, everyone. Jimenez, Alonso Jimenez, Jimbo, Felipe, Leroy, on and on and on. But what Luis is talking about, I think we were speaking earlier about new collectors. And so I often find myself under pressure to fill orders that the gallery needs because I have needs myself, be it groceries and fuel and whatever. But then you want to free up time to do things that you have this crazy idea about. And you got to just feed that idea. So you are often, Felipe had already retired. So there was that whole open space to just kind of go with it. What Davis was saying earlier, I think maybe if he would have been a bit younger, he wouldn't have been as angry that it was slipping away, and maybe would have done a lot more with it. I think that devices, people are so obsessed with the devices, including myself. And I don't know how many more new collectors, how interesting is a Honda Dillo if you have an iPhone or whatever. So, that's what I would like to say on that.
Christine, you might want to talk about
Well,
the art economies.
Well, I mean, at least at the time the whole yard phenomena was occurring, I think it was certainly the fact that there were hundreds of people showing up at his door, and that he had to literally farm out work to anybody. You know, if you want it, why don't you make it? And
He would tell people, make it yourself.
right. I mean that, which
Make it your fucking self.
yeah, right. Please.
Why are you
So
staring at me? I'm not God. Make it your fucking self.
right.
He felt that kind of pressure.
And at one point, too, I know Dave was concerned that the scene was getting very muddled because there were so many orders, and Felipe clearly couldn't handle all of that. So he enlisted other people, and then he would sign other people's work.
Well, he took
Uh,
on, at its peak, I think there were 5 to 7 of us, give or take, working full time, and
Right.
still could not fill the orders.
So that created a nightmare in and of itself, and so Dave encouraged Alonzo
He
and
was a fabulous artist.
a wonderful
I don't
artist.
think Alonso has received the attention that he deserved as an
Yeah,
artist.
I mean, Felipe always thought Alonzo was better than Felipe. You know, he just
Alonso was amazing.
yeah.
It was amazing that those two paths crossed when
Yes.
they did.
Yes.
It was a powerful team. When I think some of that work is the best stuff that was turned out of that yard. My absolute favorite is Felipe's work, of course. But, and not only, I mean, look at that. It's just amazing. And
Right.
I think, but see, when Alonso came along, it's when it got grand.
Right, because
The-
he
needed
physically could
help.
do it.
They were both physical guys.
Right.
But you need help to raise something that large. I recently worked on a large sheep, and it was very damaged. It was from the 70s, and I mean, it was huge, heavy. And I'm 46 and was struggling to turn it around, and you know, the legs were broken. But once I turned it over, it was all Felipe. And you could see that he had with an hatchet, worked that giant log, which means he wrestled it before he got the legs on it. Much older than me. So it was a very physically demanding job, is my point. And so when Alonso came, that's when the grandeur of the scale started to happen, I think, too. You know, they almost would just come up with crazy ideas and see if they could get it off the ground. It was really fun being a part of that as a young person.
But to kind of the dark side of all that, though, is that then there was so much interest that then there were parking lots full of animals, and it was just all over the place, and they're still out there somewhere, all those animals, and it really muddled what Mike was talking about, the power of the original artist, and I think it continues to muddle it to this day, really.
Felipe was quite fortunate, I think, in the fact that starting at such a late point in his life, he got to see his career do a full circle. I mean, it was birth, you know, middle and end, where it became something almost not fun anymore. And I'm so glad that Andrew did such a wonderful job getting the show together, because it's so nice to see in Felipe's hometown, and myself, and Leroy, and Luis, and everybody that's from here, an animal show at the Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe. There were shows all over the country, but not here. Not like this. And I think, again, Andrew, awesome. You know, that's a good thing.
Michael, can you speak to the economics of American folk art?
I can. The economics can't be underestimated or underesteemed, and in some ways I'm not hostile to the whole idea of economics. Economics are just a system that becomes a kind of driver in art productions. It's always been so. There's always been producers and there have always been consumers. This is part of the communicative power that we'd like to believe that art has, that somebody can make something that somebody else esteems enough that they trade goods and services or cash in the bargain, and it moves from one ownership to another where it perpetuates itself in somebody else's life. So I don't have a problem with that, but I do think, again, that the politics of an American identity gets in the way here with this enormous cachet that lives in this idea of the individual. And I'm not against the individualism that our society has tried to protect for so long, but I do have a problem with it when it becomes kind of a religious quest, and that anything that is collaborative or collective is somehow less than the pure spark of genius that comes from the individual gifted outsider among us, right? This is kind of a problem. You watch television these days, there's all these programs showing us all these amazing things that are being achieved by the teams that put satellites and probes and rockets into space. 9 years out, they sail past Pluto, and you see a room full of people all standing up and applauding themselves. It isn't one person that put that thing out there and put that probe out past Jupiter. We don't have a problem with that. We think that's a great room full of really smart people. Look what they did together. But in New York, in the art world, you bring a Felipe carving in that's got FBA written on the stomach, and the first thing somebody's going to say is, well, that isn't a pure Felipe. You know, that's one of those sort of bastardized collaborative things. There must have been 8 different people worked on this thing. Thank you, no, I don't want it. And so here we go, right? The collaboration you were talking about that was obviously productive and heightened because of the contributions of the multiple hands that went into the work is somehow no good when it comes to art, because we put such a premium on this idea of the individual and the idea of the genius, in fact, the idea of the outsider. The idea of folk art was always about community, it was always about collectivity, it was in many ways about tradition, and I think Felipe fills the definition perfectly. I think he was an innovator on one level. On another level, he told me the same thing that he told Christine. He said, I would have been a Santero, but I really wasn't good enough, and I'm not worthy to carve human figures. That was his explanation. Was it kind of pat and maybe an oversimplification? I assumed it was when he told me, but I also think there was something to it because his method of working was by the book, straight out of the Santero tradition, which is to say, he combined 3 different ways of making sculptured form. He combined carving with building or constructing, and then combined that with modeling. And so he started out with blocks, he'd shape them, they'd assemble them together, and then they'd putty up the joints and the transitions from one form into another with that sawdust paste that he used. And really we have something that's absolutely Southwestern and absolutely something that can be traced all the way back to Spain, as I said earlier. Now, this is a special kind of regional folk expression, and it's a pure folk expression, and he just turned it in a slightly different direction. Found, I think perhaps late in life, but many folk artists do find late in life, that it takes a while for life experience to filter in and then come back out in a useful way of art production. And so maybe the insight that we believe Felipe had into the animals that have been around him all his life didn't percolate till the top, to the top until late, and that's okay, because those early pieces that he produces start to grope toward it, and then he hits it, and then the market overrides, you know, his ability to produce it individually, and it goes collaborative, and it's still ongoing, and it's still something that we think about. So I think the market can't be discounted. I don't think it was a bad thing or a good thing. The fact that it exploded so is some measure of the fact that at least in one brief moment of time, there was an awful lot of appreciation for what this man did and what he did that was special, and what he did with a tradition that was shared, and the place that he took it to as an individual. And so here we have an artist who, in my opinion, is suspended beautifully between the poles that life itself suspends between, and that's probably why we're here today. And I want to say one thing, and this is a compliment to all of you and the people that put this show together. It's been a long time coming. It's been a long time coming, not only that this artist got a new look, but that the story of the yard and all of the other contributors and participants was laid bare. It was put out for you to see it, put out there for you to measure it and to know it for what it is and for the vitality that it harnessed, and not to see it as a dirty little secret that has to be buried forever with Felipe and the little whispers about the work in New York. Forget it. This is a fabulous show. It's clean, it's smart, and it's provocative, and you couldn't ask for more. Thank you.